all to attention. Welcome to Shap. It's lovely to have you here this evening. We're very pleased to be having this event, which for us is almost our final special event involved with the Celebrating Fell Ponies and, of course, the centenary of the Fell Ponies Society. It's been a busy few weeks for people, and I'd like to thank our volunteers for all their hard work in putting the exhibition together and the extra hours of stewarding, etc., as well as people from the Fell Ponies Society that have helped out with that. One more thing that's coming up is next Friday, and that's for anybody who's farming with or has had ponies on the common, particularly in the Westmoreland Dales area. And if there are some leaflets about that, the Westmoreland Dales have a project, Our Common Heritage, that they're doing. So they're interested in interviewing people about that. So ask me later if you want to know anything more about it. So I'm highly delighted this evening to have with us Bill Lloyd and Viv Woodgee, Sue Millard, Jean Scott-Smith and Ray Alderson, who've all agreed to take part this evening. And we've quite a lot to get through, so we'll try to keep tight to it if we can. Yeah. And thanks for Bill. That's he's in charge, so it's his fault if we go totally awry.
Oh yes, all right, keep it that way.
We've about 5 more people, I think, possibly may turn up, so they'll have to just dot in where they can.
Good.
So,
thank you very much. Thank you for organising this, and thank you all for coming. Now I'm surrounded by technology. There we are. I've got a stopwatch. We shall see how that works. Right, so my name is Bill Lloyd. I'm your compere for this evening. I'm going to be singing a few songs, telling a few stories, and introducing some of our guests. I'm really under slight false pretences. It should really be my brother Tom. Tom now manages the Fell Pony herd that my dad started up 50, 60 years ago, and he can't be here this weekend, so I've taken it on. I have a bit of an interest because I grew up among Fell Ponies and pack saddles, which was one of my dad's big interests. So if I can find my piece of paper, which is fairly vital, we shall make a start. There'll be an interval about 8:20, and we plan to finish 9:30, 9:40, somewhere around there. So you start with my little gizmo here. There we are. From at least as long ago as the Romans, the pony and the bigger horses, but in those days they were quite small ponies, were the mainstay of all the trade goods in the whole of the country. And the first recorded instances of pack ponies around here was in the 12th century, and they described the road that ran up from Kendal up to Shap. And this is a Victorian, no, but certainly that's 18th century, say by the costume, it could be earlier. I think that's probably an artist's impression. I don't think that's contemporary, but who knows? I don't know where the pictures, what the origin of it is. They were smallish animals, you can see, they were not great big heavy draft horses like Shires and Clydesdales. In the agricultural areas, they went for big horses, but they took a lot of feeding and a lot of care, and they were very expensive to keep. And they weren't as hardy, and they weren't as agile, and the power-to-weight ratio wasn't as good, surprisingly, as small ponies. So in the mountain areas, they stuck with the smaller ponies. And the Fell Pony would be the general workhorse in these areas, and the Dales a little bit further away, a bit bigger. But up in the hilly areas, the smaller ponies did better. They could live, as some of you will be well aware, they could live on the rough ground all through the winter and bring a nice good fall in the spring, and they were highly prized. They did the farm work, but they were also, most of their work outside the farms was on pack ponies. Now, a pack pony would carry about 200 weight, 100 weight on either side, or in different formats. There were boxes and slings and different various ways of fixing your load on, but it typically would be in groups of about 20. So 20 pack ponies would carry 2 tons. And just to give you an idea, I know this is about ponies, but I've included that because that's a comma carrier bantam from the 1950s, early 1952, and that carried 2 tons. And that was a very common. They produced thousands and thousands of those little lorries. I had one in the late 70s, early 80s, and I ran all over the north of England with fence posts and one thing and another, and carried slate and all sorts. A handy workhorse, but that replaced 20 ponies. And I'm just going on to talk a little bit about the scale of the operation with these ponies, because, well, I'll talk about that a little bit later. First, I'll move on to here, talk a little bit about this way through. You'll see this slide a little bit. Karen Griffiths, she's an interpretation officer for the Yorkshire Dales Authority, and she's produced a very good survey all about the pack ponies in this region and in the Dales in particular. So I'm not going to cover the ground that she has covered. You'll be able to look at that for yourself online if you want to. I'm just going to be bringing some different things just to add to what she has already produced. Her title, The Way Through, is the reason for the title of this evening's event. It's a very big subject, and we're only going to touch on it, but I just want to try and give you an idea of the importance of these ponies. They travelled on Packhorse bridges. These bridges were very narrow. They only needed to be very narrow because the pony only needed about a yard to get across, but sometimes the loads were 2 yards wide, so they didn't have a parapet. There were no sides on the bridges, and that's why a lot of the bridges look very dangerous. You might fall in. Later on, they built parapets, but in the early days of the pack ponies, there were no parapets. There were just little narrow clumps of stone across. That's at Wycott. You can see the wear that's at. Look how those stones are worn down. And that's Little Langdale. I've been over that bridge with the pony, as it happens. So that's made of slate. So a little bit of history now. From the foundation of the monasteries were the primary trading centres in the whole country. And in this region, Shap Abbey and Furness Abbey and Hexham Abbey were the main trading centres. And they produced wool, particularly wool. They produced a lot of meat, they produced vegetables, food and drink, cloth. And those were carried all over the country, and they kept strings of pack ponies in the monastery. Later on in the 18th century, we move on to serious beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. This is the lead mines up at Alston and Nent Head. They carried those on the pony's back. There is a sack, a Hessian sack with crushed lead ore, and they would put 2 of those, which was 200 weight, because it's heavy stuff. And they would carry. There was a single smelter in. I don't know exactly where it is. Where is that?
Hexhamshire.
Hexhamshire. What's the name of it?
Duke's House Wood.
Duke's House Wood. It was a very early lead smelter. There they would smelt the ore into. There's the ore going down on the pack train from the Pennines down into Hexhamshire, and there it is with pigs of lead, being off to London or off to Newcastle, where they put it on board a ship. To give you the scale of it, so there was 100 a day going into one factory. Did I say 100 a day? I can't remember what I said. It was like that, or 300. There were hundreds of ponies taking graphite from Keswick. They would mine for 2 or 3 years and build up a big stock, and then they'd move it all backwards and forwards for weeks on end to Newcastle, to graphite to take to London. One firm ran 100 pack horses a day. One company ran 100 pack horses a day into Manchester. And we understand from somebody, my brother told me this, I don't know where he got the information, that there were 200 ponies employed at Mosedale, just up the way here, at Mosedale Cottage, to bring slate down from the quarries. So these ponies were as common as the cars and the vans are today, and that was what they did. Now, I'm going to move on now because my interest in pack saddles came from my dad. This is Walter Lloyd, and you might have known him. That's him with his fell pony and a flat car. He lived in Rosendale, near Bacup, and he was very interested in pack ponies from the very beginning, before he even got his fell ponies. And in particular, he introduced me to knowledge about this woman, Mary Alice Hartley, also known as Ailsa Fussers. That's her donkey, was called Jerry. And she was the last of what they call the line gals. Now, there's a bit of a misunderstanding. People thought she had girls carrying loads. Gals is short for Galloways, and Galloways are Galloway ponies. And any of these little native ponies were known as Galloways. The name Fell Pony and Dales Pony and the Garrans and the Highlands and all that came later. Originally they were called Galloways or Gallas, and also known as Jaggers. That comes from the German Jäger, which is mean the hunting. They took them out when they were hunting. So this woman, she lived at a farm called Potterman Farm, and she she carried lime from Clitheroe into Manchester and Rochdale, and she carried coal back to Clitheroe. So she was working both ways, and she worked in particular this road, which is called the Limers Gate. Now that land that you're seeing is part of my dad's farm. It's at the top of the hill between Lancashire and Yorkshire, about 1,500 feet there, and his farm was down on that west-facing slope. And that road you can see between the walls, that's called the Limers Gate. That was once the main highway to Scotland, up the west side of the country. That's where Bonnie Prince Charlie's army retreated in the 45 rebellion. So the Limers Gate, it's called the Limers Gate because of the lime pack ponies that went up and down. And that's my dad on the Limers Gate with the mare and foal. Now, Ailsa Fussers. Oh yes, I'll talk a bit about my dad first on the farm. I can remember him using pack ponies on the farm. We had a little drift mine on the farm, very 9-inch seam, I think, very small coal seam. But he used to work it with his mate. They'd go in and they'd lie down and cut the coal out, and then he'd put it in Hessian bags and he'd put it on his ponies to get it back home. And in a bad winter, he would. I'll tell you a bit about this pack saddle. Ailsa Fussers lived at a farm called Potovan Farm, and that farm belonged to my grandmother. And because of that connection, in a barn nearby, he found that pack saddle, which is believed to be Ailsa Fussers' pack saddle. And he made a replica of it, which is outside in the foyer here, and then he donated that to Shipley Museum. So that's the actual pack saddle that woman used. There she is again. Oh no, I'm going back a bit. Let me just go back. I don't think. Oh yes, they come later. These other things. I was telling you a little bit about Walter and what he used his ponies for. He used them for haymaking, getting hay in, and a certain amount of cutting hay. It took a good strong pony. You need two really to cut hay, but he did use a pair to cut hay for a while. But I can remember him explaining to me how to get muck out up with pack saddles, because you'd have a box and you'd fill evenly balanced up each side, and you'd walk your pony out to the field, and when you wanted to drop your muck, you'd reach over and pull a pin out, and the bottom would fall out of the box one side, and you'd have to hold up the other side because it would fall off the pony otherwise, and then walk along wide, and then pull the pin on this side, and then end up with little muck cocks every 10 yards or so, and then you go around with a muck fork and spread them out. Not a job I fancy, but there we are. So that is Ailsa Fussers. Now, I'll talk you a bit about her. Let's see what else we've got. How's the time? Oh, don't tell me it's turned off. Excuse me 1 second. What time is it? Well, I can see. What time does it say on that clock? Can't see it from here.
10:30.
Oh, we've got a little bit of time. Not long. Okay. Ailsa Fussers, yes. He was very into this one. He did a bit of history, looking around, and he found this bell. He was given this bell by one of her descendants, who was the landlord of the Traveller's Rest at Britannia. Some of you will know that. And that was the bell that went on the Bell Mare. The Bell Mare was the lead horse. And he was given that, believed to be Ailsa Fussers' own bell. And here is a set of bells that other horses would wear, different jobs. The various reasons why they wore the bell. Apparently it kept them together. They would follow the sound of the bell. If they got lost, you could find out where they were. And the other horses would follow the sound of the lead bell. So that's that. Now, there are lots of stories about Ailsa Fussers, so I'll just tell you one or two. She was a very unusual woman. She was short and stout, and she dressed like a man and drank like a fish, is what we're told. And she was very indiscreet and very unconventional. She took a lover, a young farm boy, not far away, and they had a little child. And the child died. And she decided she was going to carry the coffin to the burial personally. So she carried her infant in the coffin, and this was a bit of a scandal. But she was well respected for all that. At her funeral, all the women of the village in Shawforth made flowers, and she had wreaths on her coffin made by the women. So although she was unconventional, she was respected. So my favourite story, anyway, about Ailsa came from one of her descendants, a man called Sam Kelly, and he told me that Ailsa was in court charged with being drunk and disorderly, and she was wearing man's clothes. She had a big old top coat and a pair of corduroy trousers and a funny hat, and she had a bit of facial hair, and she looked a bit of a strange customer. And the magistrate looked over his glasses and said, "Are you a man or a woman?" And she looked up and said, "Well, I'll swap you a feel." So that was Ailsa. Anyway, I think we'll leave it at that. We'll go back a little bit now because we went on too far. Oh no, I'm going forward. That's it, Elsa. So I'm going to leave you with that, and then I'm going to hand over now, please. Jean Scott Smith is going to recite a song and give us a recitation.